Welcome to the Institute for High Quality Software. Today's lecture is our second part on software maintenance. In our first lecture, we defined what is software maintenance, and in the second lecture, we'll talk about making software maintainable. Oftentimes, you'll hear people say, "This software is just unmaintainable. It costs too much to maintain this software." What do people mean by that? Well, this is what we think at the Institute for High Quality Software. Software is considered to be unmaintainable when the cost of performing activities to keep the software operational are too high. So, in last lecture, we talked about what software maintenance is, and we defined it as basically the activities to keep software operational. So when the cost of these activities get too high, we consider it to be unmaintainable, or to the point that, you know what, maybe the software needs to be scrapped. So what's some examples of when the costs are too high to keep software operational? Here's one. How about when there's a large number of defects? So when there's a large number of defects, then what happens is developers spend a large percentage of their time just fixing these defects, which means that developers aren't implementing new features that can potentially generate new revenue. Okay, so that's when you get to a point where, all right, maybe there's so many defects, the cost of trying to fix these defects, we just probably might want to start over. All right. What about when the activities involved deal with configuration changes? And let's just recap. When in the previous video we described some of these activities. We defined them as code changes, configuration changes, and environmental changes. And by our environment, we mean the operating environment. Okay? So these types of changes basically are the way you can categorize the activities involved for keeping software operational. So a large number of defects obviously falls under the code changes, right? Another thing is some operations that may require operators or tech support to perform too many tasks, right? Maybe they have to, clear out a database, right? Maybe they have to, before a batch process is run on a data set, they may have to manually clean the data, right? So this would be on the borderline of configuration changes, because these are, in a sense, the data itself is a parameter that affects the behavior of the software. So, and I'll just write down as an example, manual changes to data, right? And maybe you have to do these too often, too frequently. All right. And obviously there's some more examples, but these, when the software gets to a point where you have to perform these too often, or they take too long, then you start to say, okay, maybe the software is unmaintainable. So with that said, I want to drill down deeper into what affects the cost. What affects the cost of the tasks that you perform to keep software operational. And so we can categorize the costs as being the amount of times you perform the activities. So if you perform these activities, very frequently, then that can affect the cost. Or if the activities take a long time to perform, which will be the duration. So when we talk about costs, we want to categorize those costs based upon these two things: frequency, so how often you perform activities, right? And activities being activities to, I'll just say, to keep the software operational. And duration is basically, how long it takes. Right? And I'm not going to write down. So it's either how often and or how long. So like for example, if you having critical defects every day, obviously that's too often. Or you can have, even if the defects aren't critical, it could be a nuisance, but it takes a month to fix one defect, right? Then that's too long, and you're like, whoa, that's. Um, or you can think of how often you have to, manually go out and clear out a database, or clean up some data, or how often you have to change the swap out a disk, increase the disk space, right? Those are examples of frequency. And duration could be how long it actually takes you to swap out a disk and put in a new one. Now back in older days it took a long time, but now you can just hop swap disk. It takes no time, right? So these are examples of the activities. And when we design software, when we're creating software, the whole management, if we want to make software maintainable, we're going to have to try to minimize these two things. So you want to minimize duration and you want to minimize frequency. So whatever you want to do is you want to make sure you minimize those two things. So let's talk about how to reduce frequency. Reduce the frequency of the different activities. So let's take a look at code changes first. So what can we do to reduce the amount of code changes? Well, there's really only one thing you need to do, is you need to reduce defects, right? And there's several ways. One of the main ways you want to reduce defects is you want to have well written, right? Well written, well designed code. Another thing you also want is well modeled code, right? So well modeled code captures many different things, and I'm going to spend a whole lecture talking about model driven design. Sorry, actually I'm not going to just only talk about that. I'm not going to, because when I talk about model, I don't only just mean the domain model as far as like the business model, because you also have to model the environment, or be aware of the environment that the software is going to run in, and I mean not only just the the operating environment, but the operational environment. How the people involved in operations, tech support, and system administrators, what they have access to in order to make configuration changes. So you want to deal with that as well. So we're going to spend time talking about that. And so when I say well modeled, I'm actually capturing a lot of things. Basically that's capturing a lot of things about the requirements, the functional and the non-functional requirement. Configuration changes. Again, one of the main things I think you can do to reduce the frequency of activities is having well modeled code, right? Configuration changes also benefit from well-modeled code because it's going to reduce the amount of activities that operators and tech support people are going to need to do, because the designers, the implementers, the developers consciously thought out the operational environment and developed the software to minimize the work involved in making the and configuring the software. So it reduces environmental changes. The number of configurations and made it easier. And we'll talk more in the next slide about how that's done. Just capacity planning. Capacity planning. So, in other words, for people who don't know what this is basically, planning. Basically, you're planning for the future. You plan for the future, on how much resources your software is going to need. So finally, let's talk about how we can reduce the duration of activities for performing software maintenance. All right. So let's first start at code changes. So for code changes, again, the only thing that's happening is the defects occurred. So what normally takes take a long time to fix defects? Well, if the code isn't written well. So let's just say that. And that's pretty much the main thing you can do to reduce duration, right? What about configuration changes? So what can you do to reduce the amount of time it takes tech support to, say, retrieve log files, for operators to be able to make, if they need to make change to a certain variable, right? Well, I think of just, good tools. Good tools that just allow them to do exactly what they need to do quickly, right? So even though your operating tech support could be whizzes at SQL, you probably want to, instead of letting them go directly into some application that allows them to access the database directly and they have to type up SQL commands, you probably need to put some kind of GUI in front of that. Right? And likewise with log files. If you have, this applications running on, different machines, just have one console to allow the tech support person to be able to read the log files by going to just one web page and not have to worry about, going to individual different machines. Let's move on to environmental changes. What can you do to reduce the duration of environmental changes? So remember, environmental changes are you have to maybe change the operating system, change hardware, things like that. What are some things we would want to do to make that time shorter? Well, from the software development perspective, there is the limited amount of things you can do. One thing you could do is just make the software, agnostic to the operating environment as much as possible.